Hello, my ACA peeps. Welcome to this month's Town Hall, May. We're going to be talking about school counseling today. But before we get started, I want you to know that we are really excited about bringing in our brand new CEO to be a part of the ACA family. Sean Boynes will be joining us in July. He will be taking over for the soon to be departing and bittersweet in my heart to say this, Rich Yep. Rich is here today and he's going to share a few words with us today. But please just know that we are so excited about our new CEO that's coming in, and we hope that our future will continue to be bright. It's thriving as it is right now, but our new CEO is going to help take us to new heights. And with that, please let me bring in my buddy, Richard Yep.
Thank you, President Butler, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you. These have been amazing town halls all year long, and we're just so appreciative that Kent decided to do these and take the time to share such important information with you. And yes, I am also very excited about Sean Boynes coming on board as the person who will succeed me. He's a wonderful guy. I've worked with him for many years in the association industry. He's very well respected, and I feel like the association and the staff will be in very good hands. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So as I shared with you all earlier, we are going to be hanging out with Doctors Kara Aiva and Dr. Ann Shillingford Butler. They are counselors, counselor educators, school counselors. They've had the opportunity over the course of their careers to just do phenomenal work. So let me tell you a little about each of them. Dr. Kara Aiva, hers, holds many identities. Really, Kara? I didn't know all that. Many identities? Anyway, in addition to being a wife, mom, school counseling advocate, and co-conspirator in working to dismantle oppressive educational practices, policies, and systems, she is an associate. Oh, aren't you a full professor now? Somehow we have some misinformation here.
No, that's technically September 1st, right?
Well, September 1st, technically she has just been awarded full professorship at Rowan University. She's in the counselor education in the educational settings program there. And her educational career spans over 20 years as a former Spanish teacher, administrator, and professional school counselor and counselor educator. Kara uses her research for advocacy by using asset-based approaches to empower student agency. That word always makes me pause, right? Agency. Let's explain what agency is sometimes. While promoting equity and wellness, academic and mental health. Her specific interests include social emotional development, group counseling, and post-secondary career development. She consults and delivers professional development nationally to PK-12 school counselors, teachers, and administrators on strategies for cultivating a safe, equitable, and inclusive mental health and neurodiverse culture in schools. Next up, we have Dr. M. Ann Shillingford. She is an associate professor in counselor education at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. She currently serves as the coordinator of the counselor education PhD program at UCF. She has several years of experience as a professional school counselor. Prior to completing her doctorate at the University of Central Florida, Dr. Shillingford has written several articles and book chapters on multicultural issues, particularly focused on disparities among people of color. Dr. Shillingford has a keen interest in exploring measures to deconstruct educational, social, and health disparities among marginalized communities. Dr. Shillingford is currently conducting research exploring the effects of media exposure to police and community violence on the physical and mental health of Black parents raising children and youth. Dr. Shillingford's co-edited book, The Journey Unraveled, College and Career Readiness of African-American Students has been published in the fall of 2015. And Dr. Shillingford co-edited the book, Demystifying the DSM for School Counselors, was published in September of 2020. And she is under contract with Cognella to write a new book, Intersectionality, with Dr. Kent Butler. And it's going to be on techniques for learning how to be a good counselor with a multicultural social justice focus. So without any further ado, let me bring both of them in and ask how they are doing. Hello, hello, Doctors Aiva and Shillingford.
Hello.
Hello.
What's going on? What's going on?
Other than the neighbors finding right now to do the lawn, you know, I'm doing well. We're done with graduation and moved on into summer classes. So the work continues.
The work continues. Excellent, excellent. How about you, Dr. Shillingford?
Yeah, and summer classes just started this week. Actually, I just rushed because I'm covering practicum for another instructor this Wednesday and next Wednesday. So rushed from that to get here, but I'm happy.
Always busy, always doing some good work. Excellent, excellent. So today our focus is going to be on school counseling. And Dr. Aiva, you came to me and you said to me that you wanted to talk about school counseling because it's a focus that's never really been a part of the counseling community that you can see here in ACA. And so you think there's some hurdles that we have to kind of deal with. Can you kind of talk about that? What are some of the hurdles that you feel that we as counselors are needing to kind of jump over, you know, dismantle, so to speak?
Yeah. So I have shared in many discussions with school counselor educators at our various conferences, including our latest at the American Educational Research Association. And one of the things that has been really apparent in a counselor ed world, not necessarily professional counseling, is that there's always like the one school counselor, right? And so we indoctrinate doctoral students and new faculty members of school counselor ed. It's this weird space, right? We live in counselor ed and higher ed, but we work in K-12 schools, right? Whereas the counseling profession as a whole can work into all of these settings. And I think one of the largest hurdles that we are facing, we've always faced beyond role confusion is essentially like, where do we belong, right? Do we belong with educators? Do we belong with counselors? And we have research in the last year or two that really talks about us having a dual identity simultaneously as an educator and as a counselor. And I think when I think about the largest struggle we're facing right now is legislation, right? Legislation really keeps school counselors from doing what they are taught to do. And so now we're in this conundrum of how do we continue to educate trailblazers in a field where we're minoritized in counselor ed, minoritized in education, and then simultaneously educate our students to be able to navigate those waters when we ourselves have been clear for a lot of years that we're still struggling to navigate and not even under that specific legislation. So
conundrum, indeed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Definitely. So one of the things that you and I would like to talk about are several things. Let me just go down the laundry list real quick. Legislation versus ethics, the role of school counselors, mental health of students and staff, especially since COVID, SEL and CRT backlash, virtual connections, addressing race and racial issues in schools, Don't Say Gay bill, and economic impact of COVID on the roles of school counselors. Those are very heavy things that have to happen in the school environment when you're told as a counselor you shouldn't touch any of them or be near any of them. And so, Dr. Shillingford, you've been a school counselor and you worked in that realm. What's it like being an advocate for things that schools don't necessarily feel are important for school counselors to be really tackling?
It's overwhelming. You feel undervalued at times. So it takes a lot of self-preservation to keep going, really, as a school counselor. And as you were talking, I think about articles I've written, Kara had written, and others in the field. And oftentimes you see the passage when we introduce the school counselor is we say, school counselors are uniquely positioned to do such and such. And we don't take that word uniquely lightly, because as Kara says, school counselors are trained to be counselors. Let's just make it be clear, perfectly clear, that school counselors are counselors. They are trained to support individuals' mental health, emotional, social health, as well as academic in a school setting. So whether they're recognized for that role or not, whether they're encouraged to embrace the role of a counselor in schools, they are counselors. So I want to make sure that that's pretty clear. Having said that, that can be a struggle in itself. When you go through a program where you're trained to identify a certain way, and then you go into the actual setting and you're seen as something else. You feel like you're being held back or held down because you can't do the things that you're supposed to do. Because whether legislature or whoever else says school counselors should or shouldn't do anything, the situations that children and families experience, they still continue to exist. Okay. So you as a school counselor, you're in the school and you're seeing your kids are suffering with A, B, and C. And oftentimes you feel like your hands are tied because you can't really do the things you want to do or the things you're trained to do.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And so, Dr. Aiva, when she said that just now, it made me think of the fact that I always say that school counselors should get licensed. They're going through a program. Most programs, they leave out of those programs with just 1 or 2 credits shy of having the ability to be licensed as a LPC. And so what's your thoughts on that? Is that something that school counselors should be doing? Should school counseling programs change up? Should ASCA really be pushing for school counselors to be licensed? What are some things that you think should be happening in that realm?
So I recently have lots of ideas on this, but recently we are sitting in General Assembly right now in legislation, and we are really working on just even, believe it or not, professional development that's specific to school counselors as opposed to the broader school, people who work in schools. And one of the things that is unique in the state of New Jersey is that all of our K-Prep programs, will be 60 credits if they're not already, right? And what that does for us in the state of New Jersey is that our school licensure says 48 credits. So when K-Prep changed, it changed. And so one of the things that we are fighting for, because I did an analysis on this, is not every state also has a school counselor liaison person at the state level. So they're also absent from all of these conversations on wellness, mental health. They tend to end up in conversations with school psychologists, which are part of what we call school-based mental health teams, but it negates that fact. So we are trying really hard to push all of our students to get licensure, because in our state, if you graduate from a K-Prep accredited program, you just need the NCE to register as an LAC. So we are trying to figure out with our Department of Education and then our Board of Marriage and Family, how we might be able to make that seamless. Now, there's a caveat to that, So now you have a license, and should also say this, we're struggling in the state of New Jersey, and I can't speak to anybody else. We have school districts who want to use their money to try and get school-based mental health individuals, but they can't. So we're saying, but you already have these people in positions. And so how about we utilize that? But there's a lot of political aspects to think about this on a national level.
No.
One,
political?
Yeah, our model doesn't currently work for a post-pandemic realm. And so what I find beneficial to that is our new K-Prep draft standards actually drop names. They all just say comprehensive school counseling program, and so that it can ultimately meet your needs. So that's one particular piece of it. But then all schools and districts, including school counselors, have moved towards MTSS as school counselors, part of that school-based collaborative and providing services. But no matter how you look at that particular piece, now you have a deficit-based approach. We're trying to reach all students, but we're still looking at it from a deficit perspective. And so I do think that there are long-term implications for school counselors being licensed in schools, but it's going to take a lot of fortitude and strength and savviness in some ways to get everybody to play together. So that we can, this is the new vision of school counseling. We know that we are supposed to support academic, social, emotional, and career development. We also know that holistically, all three of those things are connected. And the way our systems are set up right now, it's really hard to provide access and intervention simultaneously. But if you ask me, I think all school counselors should be LPC'd, and we get rid of the, what do school counselors do? And are they really counselors? Yes, they are mental health specialists in your school that happen to understand the educational system in which they are
A
working.
little bit differently, right. So I don't know what's happening in the Florida region, but Dr. Shillingford, maybe you can talk a little bit about that from that perspective. But how did we get it so wrong? How did it become that school counselors were not seen as verified and really true to form counselors? What happened?
That is a long journey, a long history of school counselors, the role of school counselors being compounded and misunderstood. There's an older but very important article by, I think it's Lambie and Williamson, that talks about the journey of school from guidance and counseling to school counseling, and really understanding the beginnings of school as a vocational practice. And I think that has stayed within the profession. Although ACA has done significant work and other researchers and so on in really trying to change that, I don't think we've done it in the silo of counseling, the silo of school counseling. I don't know that there is, and this is just part of what I think is the problem. I don't know that there's been a lot of work done to pull other entities into the picture to really understand the role of school counselors.
So when you say entities,
somebody,
when you say entities, you're talking
yeah,
about
I'm going there. So I'm saying, even if somebody has an LPC, a school counselor has an LPC, they're in the school. If their administrator don't understand their role, what they're there for, or what they're trained to do, the administrator says, I want you to do this. You want your job, you're going to do this. So I think we need to branch out a little bit beyond just the school counseling or even the counseling profession, and try to marry folks from other programs to bring them into the true understanding of what school counselors do.
So when you talk about that, you're saying superintendents, principals, teachers, and other affiliates of a school need to understand what a counselor does, and that the counselor doesn't just do lunch duty or just hang out with the kids and have fun.
Right. And I mean, lunch duty is absolutely fine. I mean, you can do a lot with a child in the lunchroom outside of opening ketchup packets that they've already put in their mouth and tried to open themselves. You can do a lot of connection in the lunchroom, don't get me wrong, but I think there's just so much more with the role.
Right, but I think that still, even in that role, you're not allowed to do what you've been trained to do as a counselor, because there's this fear, right? And I've always heard this, and I never seen it happen, but I hear it all the time. If you say this to this kid, or if you do something like this, or if you diagnose, which again, school counselors are not necessarily going around trying to diagnose kids, but if you diagnose this kid, then the schools is going to be responsible for this kid for the rest of their time in that school district. And so is that a reality? Is that a truth? Is that a misnomer? Is that a myth? What is that?
Can I chime in on this?
You can.
Well, first, I want to say, where did we go wrong? Data. I'm just going to say that out loud. We gravitated towards using data for everything, and that led us into a different area away from counseling, right? And we're not saying counselors don't use data, but we went full hard educational as a school counselor. And so you can see how that ultimately started. But when I think about this in the broader sense, and I'm going to call neurodiversity, right? Mental health falls under the aspect of neurodiversity. And so what we've done in schools is we've separated what students get for academic and emotional supports from a special ed perspective, right? And have to be classified, right? Which is ultimately also then separate in buildings from what school counseling does. And I really think we need to go back to those entities, school social workers, school psychology, learning consultants in some states, right? OT, PT, speech. We all collectively together are responsible for students' essentially well-being, right? Academically and social emotionally. And I really think we need to go back to the drawing board on what that looks like and who provides each one of those services and how they all work together as a team. And in schools, that's not what happens. They're completely separate. So even if the rest of our counseling world doesn't understand necessarily what we do, at least the people we are working with every day
Sure.
are trained on that particular piece too. But that also takes a lot of legwork right now too. We call them wellness teams. And so we're trying to rebuild what we call wellness teams, but we need to have it modeled at the state level before we can model it at the school level.
So there's a blurring of the roles between a school counselor and a social worker and a school psychologist and all these other roles that are in the school. What's the truth? What are the duties, or what are the actual abilities of school counselors versus social workers versus school psychologists? And why is it always that, oh, well, a school counselor is here, we don't need a social worker, or a social worker is here, we don't need a school counselor? So which one do you want to tackle?
But
that
it's
one?
not territorial, right? It's not. And I will say this, California did a really good job. And let's talk about California typically has one of our largest ratios, right? But California created a school-based mental health model to send to all schools that says, this is what a school counselor does, this is what a school social worker was, this is what a school psychologist does, and this is how they all work together. And I think we need that on a more global, national way. Our social
writing about that?
Yeah.
How come you, full professor, are not writing about that and making that a platform? What are you doing?
You're right. I'm definitely not doing anything. That's what I'm going to work on right now. I'm not going to lie. I ultimately gave up on school counselors per se in professional development and started targeting teachers, because here's what the reality of today is. Mental health is so high for both teachers and students. School counselors actually don't have time for everything else, right? Like, it's the immediacy of what's going on. And yet it's all connected to their academic piece and to their post-secondary and kind of career piece. And you ask this question, what are they allowed to do? What are they not allowed to do? Let's be clear, and any school counselor in any state will tell you this, they are not allowed to pull kids from classes. So we have all these interventions, and I'm also going to be honest about this too. Our basic skill set is also in group counseling, right? Whether we're in classrooms, whether we're in a small group, whether we're coordinating a meeting, every skill requires group counseling. And yet our counselors take one class, right? But in general, that is a skill set that is essentially one that all school counselors master. And yet they're not able to deliver because we place this value on being present in academic classes is going to be more beneficial than the potential one class you miss as a result of the 6-week group, right? For the benefit of others. So schools place value on academics and testing and not whether or not they're well enough to be able to do that. So that's a whole nother layer.
So can you speak to that, Dr. Shillingford? Because I think there's something to be said about the fact that when you pull a child out of a classroom who's hurting, who's dealing with some serious things that's not allowing them to pay attention in the classroom in the first place, that is some type of demerit to the kid for the rest of the time that they're going to be going through that particular school year. Can you talk about that from that perspective? Why is it that people are seeing this wrong, that pulling a kid who is hurting out of a classroom might stop some of the things, and I won't necessarily go there, but there are things that students are doing in schools that are harmful to a whole lot of other students. students who are brandishing weapons and all kinds of things that are happening, that if you have gotten to them at a certain point in time, you might have been able to kind of help them work through whatever issues they were dealing with in the first place. Can you talk to that?
I will start by saying that the American educational system is pretty jacked up right now. I'm just going to put that, you might get some emails, some texts and so on, but I'm just put this right there.
Listen, I just host this thing. I don't know. ACA is not responsible for the
The
content.
statements made here are that of Dr. Shillingford and not anyone else. But I say that to say that things are so upside down that state testing accountability these are the standards that we measure children by, that we measure the teachers and so on, so that anything else that's not connected to a state test is not as important. So regardless of a child who's coming in with, some type of emotional situation, they need to get into that classroom. We're getting ready for testing, we're preparing for testing, and that's what we need to focus on. And I think it's a systemic thing from up top that is just very flawed. And I know that I've communicated with school administrators, principals who said, I really understand what you're saying. I really understand the importance of children, and I could do my best to ensure that school counselors or children get the support they need. But we've got to focus on accountability, because my superintendents and so on, that's what they're expecting from us. And when you have individuals where let me just say their livelihood is connected to student performance, your job, your merits, and so on, then it makes a big deal, even if teachers really want, to make that distinction.
You make a good case for the fact that disparities and socioeconomic status, all these things are really affecting, how these students show up. If you really look at a school system that was built on the model of how they felt students can persevere and do well, those students were coming into those school buildings every day, well-fed, had a good night's sleep, were doing the things that were necessary. And then you put that up against a student who is dealing with trauma at home, or dealing with, not being able to sleep at night because something's happening in their neighborhood, or there are things where they didn't eat breakfast in the morning, so they didn't come with a well-balanced meal. And so we can put a Band-Aid on something by giving a food plan for kids to come in and have breakfast in the morning, but we're just putting a Band-Aid there. We're not looking at the whole picture of what needs to happen in those communities, what needs to happen in those school districts, and what needs to happen with the teachers and the counselors who are working with these kids to be non-biased, to be able to work with these individuals from all perspectives, right? That's the multicultural social justice counseling competencies piece. And if they can do that, then they might be able to have a kid that can stay in the classroom and not go see counselors. What about that?
Well, at the same time, so I'm just going to report this. As of fall 2021, 50% of all students have had at least one traumatic experience, right? 50% of all of our students under the age of 18. And when you think about all of the major incidences that have happened that have harmed people, like Parkland, including what just happened in Buffalo, you will see that there were aspects in which educational systems could have triaged and caused different outcomes, right? Like they're a part of what that different outcome is. And nothing's more apparent than obviously what happened this Sunday. And so that then begs the question, like, okay, so we want outcomes, but we also want healthy individuals who are able to contribute moving forward. And I think a conversation I just recently had with someone, she's 40 years old, she was a college teammate, and she's very happy about the progress she is making in counseling because she realizes why all her past relationships didn't work, right? All these interpersonal skill sets, right? That you could get if we normalized counseling interventions early on and specific in schools. Why do kids have to wait until they're 30 and 40 to realize partly what they got from their families or at home or from teachers were impacting their lives long term. Why can't we start mitigating that? And that is normalizing the fact that, yeah, we talk about mental health in school. We are mental health specialists. Now, I can't speak to all school counselors. There is a very different aspect between those that were pretty much, I would say, upper 90s and above trained versus the people who are still in the field that were trained previously. But the other thing that we also know, right, is that specific professional development didn't take place. So we never even filled the gap of what we'll call guidance counselors to even have the same skills that school counselors are now being trained today for. So there is a continuum that is existing in the workforce. So we've never addressed the past, but we can address the future moving forward. And I think we need to normalize, I don't know if any of you've ever had a massage, but I just recently had like my first massage. And one of the things I realized is that was the first time in 3 years that like I was not on, right? Like you don't know when you're in trauma and in survival mode and all of these things, right? That it's been happening, but we aren't teaching kids either to start recognizing these things and then to start to provide some of those interventions in schools. And I think we need the support of not just the educators in general, we need the global support of the entire counseling profession, that it shouldn't be school counselors anymore who are fighting this battle. We need our mental health, marriage and family, right? Who see all of these people to help us in addressing this particular piece as well.
Well, I'm glad you cleaned that up because I didn't know where you were going with that in terms of the massage thing. So, Dr. Shillingford, you've been doing research with Black mothers and their children, especially Black boys. And can you talk a little bit about what are those parents saying? What are those mothers saying about the school system, and especially counseling and school counselors in that perspective? What do they need or what do they want from school counselors to support them as they raise their children?
They want to be seen. They want to be valued. They want to be accepted. And they don't want to be judged. They don't want to be judged as people who are uninvolved with their children. They also want school counselors and educators to understand that outside of the normal practices that we see as school involvement, let's say going to PTA meetings and daddy-daughter dance, or even tutoring and those types of things, outside of that, parents of color, especially Black mothers, they have an added role of doing that. I just blanked out on the term, but it's a social piece that you have to do. When we talk about the talk, giving your kids a talk, that is an added role that a lot of parents have to do with their children. And so a lot of the mothers that we spoke with said people don't recognize that we are so involved with our children, almost to the point of being physically sick and mentally sick, because we are so involved, we're so connected. For us, it's not just about the academic piece. We are even more so concerned about our children's psychological and mental health.
So you speak volumes with the fact that on top of the normal, what Dr. Spock would say you need to be doing as a parent, then you have some communities of people who are doing even more than that in terms of trying to help raise their children, and then get told, guess what? You're not a good parent because you didn't go to the PTA meeting, or you didn't do this, you didn't do that. But again, not taking into context the whole picture of what's happening in that family system is really what the detriment is, when you have officials who are working in the schools who just can't see beyond the school walls. Right. So Dr. Aiva, we talked about a laundry list of different things. There are two things in this laundry list that I want to try to get to before we close out the hour. One is the SEL and the CRT backlash, and the other is the Don't Say Gay bill that is happening. What's happening in our schools that school counselors can be doing to either support or to at least get the difficult dialogues started when it comes to these issues? Oh.
No, I was just thinking that's a really like loaded
Well,
question.
you were saying I was going to go there. I'm going to go there.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
going to
yeah.
go.
So
Every other time you were saying you're going to go there. So now I want you to just, now I'm giving
yeah.
you, I'm giving you license.
So it's not a secret, right? We can actually trace this back, but it's not a secret that when the backlash came for CRT, they tied social emotional learning to it. And then because they tied social emotional learning to it, they also tied school counseling to it, since we were the ones, right, originally responsible for social emotional development. And so I think it's hard. Now, I work in a state that has 561 different school districts. And while our state legislation is fairly strong, our local school boards are not, right? They can just go against anything that they want to. And so we're starting to see a lot more of that. That also is very conflicting for both the current school counselors who are out there, and then simultaneously those that are learning about this, right? Right now, as it is happening in real time, right? And we don't have a whole answer for that, in the sense of, we don't know, particularly when it comes to the state of Florida, right? How are they really addressing that? Because they're pinning people to basically out each other as well. So not just the student who might be questioning their sexuality or gender, but they are also asking for people to tell on each other, right? Which really creates this level of divisiveness. And so think about students who are coming into school counseling professions and then also being supervised by people who are in the field who are going through this simultaneously. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm fearful, right? Because to Anne's point, for our school counselors and school counselors in training, this is livelihood, right? And then it raises a question, like, is one life more valuable than the other, that we can't have the discussion or be confidential or things of that nature, right? Because it's a risk we talked about the other day. And that now school counselors are going to be made to have choices whether or not they want to risk, right, their jobs for advocating, for doing all these things, right, that our codes of ethics tell us as systemic change agents, right? And so I think there is a way to be very savvy in language about twisting what it is that you are doing, right? But it doesn't mean that everybody has that skill set to be able to do that either. And so we really do have to come up with, I believe, more of a national plan, both from counseling and school counseling, on really how to approach that also from an educational way, right? They're going to have to walk and navigate these systems, also being told to be advocates for children and removing barriers, but the law says something completely different. And if we're not unified on kind of what that messaging is, I worry about how diversified that message is across all the other different states as well.
So you brought up code of ethics, and what do you see as the thing that the code of ethics really supports in school counseling that we aren't doing, and how do we get there? You know, I got one of my colleagues, and I'm not going to call them by name, who's on the call right now, who is an ethics guru for ACA, and I wonder if they can promote that person up to talk about code of ethics in school counseling as well. That would be great. But can you talk a little bit about that in terms of what is it that the code of ethics say that support what you're talking about with regards to these different things? That was for you, Kara.
Okay, I was just about to ask that. Was that for me or your colleague who's on the call? I was just telling my kids to be quiet as they walked in the door. So I think the systemic change agent piece and addressing equity is huge. And I think that the backlash and social emotional, right, learning is all over our codes of ethics as well. But I think what's happening causes people and students and current school counselors to question then. Because if you think about this, and if you've been a school counselor and you're on this call, right, we've always used the code of ethics to advocate what we do, right? If they say, no, you need to be doing this, we're like, no, we don't, right? Like, here's what our codes of ethics say. And now we're in an opposite position, just globally, where our codes of ethics potentially place us in what I'll call harm's way, for lack of a better term right now, in doing our particular job. Now, again, I'm not in a state that's fighting this, but it doesn't mean that our local school counselors aren't doing that as well. And I see people on this call from Alabama and from Florida, right? Where it's a very different mix, right? And so I don't know that there is an answer to what needs to be necessarily in there, right? That could also help us in this regard. And I say that to say, because they're also redoing the codes of ethics right now, like a new version is coming out, like there's a draft out right now. So I don't know I can honestly say, I don't know that I know the answer, but I do feel like it's something that we have to attend to.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And so we'll come back to the code of ethics piece, because I want to bring in one of my colleagues here as well. But Dr. Shillingford, I'm going to ask you a question. How have you seen mental health changes in students with regards to how they are dealing with the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and the pandemic that people are calling that's been happening in Black and Brown communities? What are some of the things that you've been noticing, and what are some of the things that school counselors have been having to deal with, do you believe?
Certainly the emotional and the psychological toll of the pandemic. Many students have lost family members, they've lost teachers and others in their schools and within communities. They've lost social connections, their friends that they probably were raised with at different grade levels, who have relocated for whatever reason, their parents lost their jobs and so on. So there's been a lot of loss, and I've actually done some research. We're doing the data analysis right now, and loss seemed to be the significant theme in there. We interviewed children from K to 12. And that loss, the loss of, like I said, social connections, loss of the language that the students mention is that loss of independence, loss of freedom. Those are the things that they felt they've really experienced over the pandemic. And then now having to go back into the schools and almost act like we're back to normal. And that's why it really annoys me when people say we're in post-pandemic, we're back to everything back to normal. And there's absolutely nothing normal about this. Even when the government or whomever says that we're in an endemic, no longer a pandemic, there's nothing normal that's going to be happening anytime soon in our systems. And so we really need to pay attention to children. It's a little difficult for schools, for teachers, for counselors, because there are a lot of kids started school online. And so there's no behavior to measure that, okay, before the pandemic, the child was acting this way, and now they're acting that way. So there are a lot of gaps in what we can see and how we approach children. But certainly that's significant loss, an academic loss. A lot of high school kids miss out on different opportunities, graduation requirements, and so on. So that's sort of a part of what kids and families are really dealing with, and teachers also. I do have to give teachers credit for all that they're doing in schools right now, putting themselves on the front line and trying their best to support the kids that they're working with and the families.
I actually did similar research to Dr. Shillingford, and I think one of the things I just want to add to that piece is that all of the mental health affects executive functioning. And so now we are in schools where everyone has this expectation of what students should be doing and how they should be performing. And realistically, their brains, right, with all of this mental health that they're not working through, doesn't allow them to do that. And so for people who potentially are suffering greatly, right, it also puts them at risk to be even further behind, because we're not attending to those things, because it's and then it affects their executive functioning. And so I think one of the other things that is missing, to your point about going back to normal, Anne, is that for so long in schools, and particularly in our field as well, we give resources to students when they are classified with something, right?
Right.
Instead of starting early in kindergarten, right, here are academic and emotional tools that you can utilize, right, in order to work for you or for your brain or for whatever the case may be, and normalize that instead of saying, okay, well, we're only going to chunk now because you're classified for blah, 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 or whatever the case may be. Because when they're classified for special ed, sure, we go for accommodations, but why not educate all students on all resources that could be available for them so they then can advocate for the tools that they potentially need? And in some cases, if it is emotional, then we can find emotional tools for you in the classroom as well. But until we can have that dialogue, right, and that it's everyone's issue, not just certain kids.
But aren't you compounding the issue when you make a kid think about that when they may not have been thinking about that before? So,
oh, really? Like if we talk about sexuality, I might actually, if I read a book about transgender, that automatically means that I'm going to relate.
But isn't that the way that legislators and others are thinking about these types of things, and that don't support us moving forward in that regards?
Yeah.
How do we combat that? And so as you are pondering that, I have a colleague I'm going to pull in here. I think she's coming in. And I want to go back to the piece on the SEL in the CRT when it comes to the code of ethics, and especially, I guess, like with the issues like the no, don't say gay bill, all those things are impacting school counselors. And Lynn Lindy, who has just popped in, is also a former school counselor.
Who taught me ethics, just so you know, as in my master's program.
Who taught Kara Aiva ethics. So you heard what we were talking about here. How does the code of ethics affect that? And what should school counselors take away from the code of ethics that could support them in their work with students who are struggling with these particular areas, or school districts or communities that are dealing with this particular area?
That's a great question. It's also an incredibly difficult question, because counselors are always held to a higher standard. And we expect so much of our professionals, of counselors in general. And I think we expect even more of school counselors. At least counselors working in other settings are surrounded by other mental health professionals who understand what it is they do. School counselors are surrounded by people who really don't get what they do lots of times. And there's that lack of understanding. So they can find themselves isolated. And I particularly feel for elementary counselors when they're the only counselor in a building, and there may be a part-time school psychologist or a part-time school social worker or somebody else that they can form an alliance with. So we still expect them to do the right thing and to advocate for kids and to hold up those standards and act like those laws aren't, not that they don't exist, but they still have to do what the right thing is for kids. And that puts them in a really, really difficult position, because if they don't, then we say they're practicing unethically. And if they do what the law is, now, if it's a law that you absolutely, then law trumps ethics. But in schools, lots of times, it's a little fuzzier. There are certain laws that are very clear and others that have a little more wiggle room. So I think it's a question of building alliances within the school. School counselors, for better or worse, always have to have an alliance with the principal, because if they have the support of the administration, they can do almost anything. If they don't have the support of the administration, as you all know, it makes their jobs really hard. And so to build those alliances with parents and the community and the kids, because the kids can advocate for what the school counselor does too, but they still have to hold the line with ethics. So they've got to figure out a way around this. And I think there's a whole nother set of things that we need to do around these laws and ethics. So that can't be answered in 2 minutes.
So are you suggesting then that because of that, school counselors shouldn't take the risk?
Oh, no. I think ethically you have to take the risk. You have to do what's best, your obligations to your students.
Okay.
You have to do what's best for them. But I think they have to be prepared that doing what is ethically right may put them in an untenable situation. So my suggestion was they've got to build those alliances within the school community so they're not there advocating by themselves.
Okay. That's great. I appreciate that because, you know, I sit and I think about all the things that are happening, and the lack of voices in the school systems that don't stand up for things that are just common sense to me, and maybe it's not, right? But when somebody talks about CRT and they put it down, I'm like, you're talking about history.
The lawyer can't get this in the afternoon.
I don't know what that is.
Oh God, yeah. Oh, that lawyer always mess up.
I don't know what happened here. But history would tell us that CRT is okay. So could we stand behind ethics and say, look, this is really what history is? I mean, I'm not telling them something that has happened, but then they talk about the emotional welfare of some students over the others. Thoughts? Anybody can chime in. Dr.
Well, I
Shillingford?
think the important thing there is that schools generally don't talk about CRT. I mean, there are underlying concepts that may be introduced in the school counseling language, but folks don't teach CRT in schools.
But they teach history. Well, that's my whole point. They teach history, and history is what people are saying CRT is why they don't want it to be in the schools. So they're essentially saying don't teach history. They're not saying don't teach CRT.
How much time do we have? Because that would take a whole lot of time to have this here discussion.
Well, we might not be able to do it now, but I think that's something that we need to kind of look at, because so many people have co-opted the message of so many things that are supportive of school counselors and school systems and the understanding of history, so that it fits their mode of living. But and again, that isolation is it really does not give others the opportunity, right? It doesn't include the other voices that should be at the table. Kara, I see you shaking your head. What's your thought?
Well, you know, people, I have sat with people who sit opposite in belief systems to me, right? And, you know, people ask, do you teach CRT, right? So you're asking the same question in some ways. And I'm thinking to myself, so you're right? History is one narrative of that particular piece, but I would say that we train school counselors through a CRT lens because, again, our standards and codes of ethics need us to have that lens in order to address oppression, access, barriers, right? Equity in schools. And so I think that's complicated because I would never say that I don't teach through that lens, right? Because how do you not in order to do these things in schools? And I would say that there are some teacher educators who would also say the exact same thing. It doesn't change who has power right now. And so to Dr. Lindy's point, right? Community affiliations are important because most of the movement that we have seen to take any shape whatsoever has been from a grassroots community aspect. And so I hear you on answering the CRT question, but that to Anne's point, that is extremely consuming and time.
So making it simplistic, right? I'm like this. If anybody ever came up to me and I'm doing work, and this is just me speaking, this is not anything to do with ACA or where I work and any other stuff. But if I was in the school system teaching or working and somebody told me I was doing CRT, I would fight that and say, no, I'm not. I'm teaching history. Prove me wrong.
And now I see your point, right? So I would say that I'm working with students on their lived experience, right? Like, how do you change that narrative, right? My students have a lived experience and I am listening to it, right? And attending to that particular piece. I think you were using you want different language to say that. I think that's how that's one way I would go about it.
Right. But it's again, that makes me feel like now I have to be sneaky with it, right? And it's like, no, I just want to be upfront and honest with you. Slavery happened. People got hurt. The Irish famine, it happened. You know, we brought people in and we put them in concentration camps, even in the United States, right? All these things happened. So for us to run from that and then say, oh, we're talking CRT because somebody wants to put that narrative into space, who is controlling the money in the school systems and all this other stuff, if we don't challenge it with truth, then we're always going to be beholden to these people who want to stay in positions of power by way of keeping people in the dark.
So I learned this from a fellow counselor educator at ACES, actually, from Montana, and how she starts her multicultural classes. And I start now all of my PDs in some ways, right? That oppression, right, is real. So are different identities, and that they both can intersect and affect people's mental health. And if we can all agree to that right now, then we can start from that same place. But I will also admit, sometimes I just say blanketly, schools are oppressive systems, and that's where we're starting, right? Like, if we all can agree on that particular piece, because here's the thing, any person in the school system can feel like it's oppressive for them. Is it the same? No, but in their minds, they'll agree to that in that moment before we move on to something else.
Dr. Shillingford, last words before we break into our breakout sessions. You had something you were going to say. I think I seen you on mute.
Oh, I was already on mute. I didn't have anything, but I will say something. I will throw this out there. When we talk about coming together and advocating for the role of school counselors and pulling in stakeholders and so on, I would love for folks who are listening to look at it on a bigger umbrella. We've got ASCA over here, we've got ACA over here, and I don't know if there's what the connection is. And I would think it's important for us to start looking at that big picture of what are the messages we send to our school counselors, mental health counselors, or marriage and family counselors, when you've got those two groups working together, recognized by one association, and then the other, it's kind of like you're over there. So when we're in class and we're talking about ASCA, then folks look over here, but then the main conversation is with the majority of the class. And I do think that it's a disservice to school counselors. I think it does add to the marginalization that the profession continues to experience. So hopefully something can come from this town hall meeting.
Well, colleagues, thank you so much. Dr. Lynn Lindy, Dr. Kara Eva, Dr. Ann Shillingford, thank you so much for being a part of this. Lynn, thank you for coming in, pulling you in. I knew you were probably back there going, what's he doing? And so anyway, I know that you just have a voice that is needed to be heard, especially when it comes to the code of ethics. And I always wanted to get the code of ethics right. I always want people to hear it from the person who knows what's best. And so, and why not bring you in for that? And so with that, I'm going to pull us out. Thank you again for being here today. And I'm going to call in Brandy or someone from the team who is going to allow me to kind of pull back, and they're going to share with me what's next for what we're going to be doing with our breakout groups.
Yes. So next we have the next 45 minutes or so dedicated to breakout rooms. So attendees, if you are able to stick around for the next part of this town hall, please do. We are going to open up self-select breakout rooms. If you're not familiar with that, you'll see a pop-up window come up on your screen, and you can choose which room you'd like to join. We have a room that is topic focused. That is where our speakers will be for today. We have a room where you can chat with Dr. Butler. We have a room for students. We have a room for practitioners, and we have a room for counselor educators. So that window should be up on your screen right now. So you can feel free to join whichever room you'd like. And if you need assistance, I would be happy to get you there.
And you can jump into another room if you like, but don't leave the meeting. Make sure you leave just the room, right?
That's a good point, yes.
Brandy, did you say Ann and I are going to today's topic?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll meet whoever wants to show up in the chat with the president.
Folks, if you need assistance getting to your room, just go ahead and unmute yourself and let me know what your name is and where you'd like to go.